Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. Stephen Friedman is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, an artist, a scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. We would like to give big thanks to Stephen Friedman for joining us weekly. Also, big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Make sure to give your feedback, ask the questions, and we will definitely address them in the next session. And today we'll address the questions from the previous week. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you, Aaliyah, as always, for the introduction. Thank you for facilitating these talks on a weekly basis. I also want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty, Elmira, Dana, everybody involved in providing this platform and ongoing support for this platform to present philosophical perspectives on an endless array of topics, typically related to some international day of recognition or celebration, something of historical significance that resonates philosophically. Obviously, everything, given the nature of philosophy, resonates philosophically. Philosophically is the one branch of human activity that concerns itself with everything, stands in criticism of every methodology because it's operating from the highest possible level of rigor, as I've emphasized repeatedly, which means the highest possible perspective on whatever the activity happens to be, whether it's science, technology, aesthetics, ethics, and the broadest possible issues, such as will be the topic of tonight's talk, which is actually inspired by, in relation to questions that I received for last week's talk, which is about the nature of meaning, the meaning of life, the meaning of the world. So the actual title that I gave to today's talk, the meaning of words, lives, worlds. It's a broad concept, but it's exactly the type of concept that philosophy is most comfortable addressing, most adept at addressing. And in fact, it's only philosophy that has the capacity to answer our considerations, our questions about the nature of the meaning of a word, the nature of the meaning of anything and everything. Well, I always like to reference the initial thought or idea that came to mind when a topic suggests itself. And for today's talk, what came to mind is a book by a professor of philosophy that I had in college, Stanley Cavell. I've referred to Stanley Cavell before. Let me show you a picture so we can visualize. Now, in this photograph, he's a little bit older than he was when I had him. I had him actually for a course on Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. Here is Stanley Cavell. Again, late in his life. He died not too long ago, just a few years ago, actually. He was an eminent member of Harvard's philosophy department. He was somewhat enigmatic. His lectures were always captivating, or at least had moments of extreme kind of captivation when he would say something that was extraordinarily compelling. Now, as I think back on my Harvard experience, I think I've mentioned that I spent most of the time in libraries, most of the time not going to lectures of Harvard philosophy professors, but of reading Kierkegaard or Wittgenstein in the library, because I was interested in the highest level that philosophy had ever achieved. And even though the Harvard Philosophy Department, when I was there, was considered perhaps the most eminent, the most distinguished in the world, it's hard for any department at any time to compare to the greatest the greatest figures in the history of that field. And those were the people that I was constantly going to. There's advice I give people that when it comes to addressing major writers, major figures, major minds, one should go to the best first, because one might not have time to get to anybody else. So it was always important for me to read through Kierkegaard, read through Wittgenstein, read through Hume, even more than it was to spend time in Harvard's, in lectures by Harvard professors. But Cavell said remarks, probably I remember more specific things that Cavell said in that course on Wittgenstein than I remember from any other specific course, certainly that I took in the philosophy department. I've referenced some of these things before, but not all of them. Like, just to give you a sense, he made a remark, I'm paraphrasing it now. I used it in Phalaris's Bull because I had a similar form that had occurred to me. It's to like only one song is not to like music. It's a comment about actually the nature of language, the nature of comments. He also once made a remark that connects to a lot of what I've said about the nature of heuristic spaces. During our course, or around the time of the course, there was a conflict, I think, in Bangladesh. And physicians were coming in from different parts of the world to offer help to the people of that country. Typically, those physicians were not able to speak the language of the country, the language of the people. And Cavell talked about some news footage that he had seen where he watched the interaction between the doctors and the people that they were treating. And he said there was no verbal exchange, there wasn't a common language that was shared, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the physicians had the medicines, had the medications, had the treatments. When you have a solution to a problem, the surrounding features, become irrelevant. I've stressed a lot about the nature of solutions as being convergences. A drug, a vaccination is a highly convergent result, in the sense that a lot of years of development, a lot of ideas, a lot of experimental effort goes into the creation of that result. So it's highly convergent, even though we see it as a singular thing now that can be administered as a pill or as an injection. But in the absence of that concentrated result, we want to use as many convergent elements that might not be yet coming together, cohering in a single result, but that will help achieve a particular end. So, for example, when we don't have definitive cures for diseases, it helps to invoke a placebo effect. It helps that physicians wear white coats. White coats have an aura that tends to give us confidence, tends to give us hope, tends to give us faith in what they are offering us. Well, we would like to achieve a result so strong within medicine, in the treatment of a given disease, that it doesn't matter how the physician dresses. But in general, we're not at that point. I've mentioned recently that even today, 30% of the effectiveness of any approach in treatment is a placebo effect, is the belief that the patient has that it's going to work. So Cavell would make remarks like that lingered with me in ways that most other lectures by other professors there did not have a lasting impact, a lasting effect. It was also Cavell that stressed that when we were studying the philosophical investigations, to spend time not reading associated writings, secondary writings of Wittgenstein, but that if we had time to read such writings, it were better not to read those at all, but just to spend that time reading the investigations a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time. Again, it's an illustration of the power, the value, the significance of repetition, right? That doing the same thing repeatedly is not insanity, it's the path to understanding and mastery. So you see how rich in experience someone like Cavell in particular was able to offer. Well, he wrote a book that was actually not assigned. The one writing of his, and I'll mention it because it did have an impact upon me. The one writing of his that was assigned was an essay on, well, the title was The Availability of Wittgenstein's Later Philosophy. It was an essay that received a lot of attention, a lot of acclaim, about how poorly Wittgenstein was understood. This was, a number of years ago at this point. I think it's still applicable, though, to the contemporary philosophical world. Wittgenstein is still poorly understood. Every major philosopher is poorly understood. It's typically only philosophers at the level, of a Hume that can understand Hume, at the level of a Kierkegaard that are able to understand Kierkegaard. So philosophical understanding of the greatest figures in the history of the subject tends to be difficult to achieve. So this was an article about that. He made the comment in the article that I actually use at the beginning of one of my websites, that Wittgenstein, much as Freud, was interested in avoiding understanding unaccompanied by inner change. I feel the same way. I feel the same way about my talks, about my work, that it's not a matter of achieving a superficial understanding. It's a matter of really rethinking the thoughts that a Wittgenstein might have had, rethinking the thoughts that I might have had in developing, these kinds of results. Only when you sort of move through the ideas yourself do you achieve a grasp of them that internalizes them and changes how you view the world. Well, that essay, as I recall, was published as part of a series of essays in a book whose title came to me when I first thought of what today's talk would be. The title of the book is Must We Mean What We Say? Now, notice it contains the word meaning. Traditionally, prior to the 20th century, when it was a question of investigating a concept like meaning, the nature of meaning, or what it is to mean something, the first thing people would do would go to a dictionary. In many cases, that would be the first and last thing that people would do. That was considered to be the path to truest understanding. 20th century philosophy in general, or the Anglo-American tradition in 20th century philosophy, the type of philosophy practiced especially in the English-speaking world, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, has tended to focus on a different approach, largely under the influence of people like Wittgenstein. And that approach is, we investigate instances in which the word is used, in which it occurs. That title is one such instance. When I talk about meaning, I would maybe consider to myself situations like, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Or, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to hurt you. You took that the wrong way. I meant it differently. What do you mean by that remark? What does Shakespeare mean when he says tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace? What does it all mean? So we consider actual instances of the use of the word rather than going again to a dictionary. The authors of a dictionary don't have the kind of, or aren't using the kinds of philosophical approaches that, again, 20th century philosophy has emphasized. And it's part of my training in philosophy. So that's where typically I begin. That's what I always recommend, whatever else you're going to do in investigating the nature of a concept, of a word, to at least incorporate that approach. Because that's one of the main methodological contributions that 20th century philosophers have made to the pursuit, the practice of philosophical understanding. In terms of that question that Cantwell raises in his title, must we mean what we say? It's actually an enigmatic, a strange question. And it has a simple answer. And the simplest answer is actually given by what I've just kind of illustrated for you. We have a linguistic form. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to say that or say that in that way. I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean it like that. You took what I said in the wrong way. If we didn't have such forms of response, then yes, then we would have to mean what we say. But the fact of the matter is, we have ways of countering, denying what we are saying or what we are meaning or what are the way something that we're saying is received. It's the nature of the linguistic context, the possibilities that our language presents that provides an answer to that question. No, we mustn't. We don't have to mean what we say because we can deny that we meant such and such. There are accepted, recognized linguistic forms of response that allow us to pull back from a particular claim, especially if that claim is misunderstood. It relates to this concept of the nature of the meaning of a word, of how language means, that has been prominent in the work of Wittgenstein, in the work of a lot of 20th century philosophers. And that is the idea that the meaning of a word, and I've investigated this, I've discussed this in some previous talks, the meaning of a word is not the object for which the word stands. That's how we typically think of meaning. When we think of the meaning of cat, well, it's that. If we have a cat that we can point to. If we think of the meaning of phone, well, here's a phone. That's what the word phone means. It means that object. Light, table, wall. The meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands. And we can see how we might think that. The philosopher Plato had that kind of notion of meaning, where there were a word like, or concept like rectangle had stood for a particular pure object, the perfect rectangle, that each rectangle that we might encounter in a geometry book, on walls, as abstractions of the form of photographs or pictures, are instances of that form kind of come to life, but come to life in imperfect instances compared to that perfect form of an object of a rectangle. So that meaning has traditionally been seen as a thing, as an object, something that one can point to. The Wittgensteinian notion, I've given you some examples of how this works. I don't think we have time to go into. I gave you an example of people engaged in the building of a house in a primitive society, where a primitive language was being employed. And the entire culture consisted of house building. And one person would be in a quarry where there were stones and bricks maybe that had been formed. And there was some distance away an actual building site. And the person at the building site would announce, maybe he would yell out, maybe he would show a word, like brick 2, stone 3. And when the person at the quarry, the site where the stones and the bricks were, that person would find 2 bricks, 3 stones, whatever, the number and whatever the designation was, and bring it over to the building site. And one can imagine that being the entire language, the entire activity of the culture. If one asks, well, what's the meaning of the word brick? Well, it's how that word is used. It's that you see that word or you hear that word and you bring this object over. It's not just a matter of the word standing for the object, but the word relating to the activity of bringing that object over. So it comes down that notion is distilled into the conception that the meaning of a word is its use, not the object for which the word stands. And that's, I think, clarified a little bit when you think in terms of the early stages of language learning, where at some sophisticated level of familiarity with the culture, I can point to something and I can make it clear whether I'm pointing to a shape, an object, a color, something particular. I can communicate through a pointing gesture. But early on, when you, let's say, use a pointing gesture to a very young child, it won't be clear what that gesture means, how it's to be interpreted. Are you pointing, again, at a shape, at an object, whatever that is, at a color, at any of a number of things that the pointing gesture does not in and of itself make clear? It takes a lot of sophistication, a lot of learning about language and about culture for the pointing gesture to become meaningful. It was often seen traditionally that the pointing gesture would define the object. Again, like I illustrated at the beginning, what's a cat? It's that. What's a phone? It's that. But the more contemporary view, the more sophisticated understanding is that the word plays a role in a culture, in a form of life. There's a famous remark that Wittgenstein makes to illustrate the point. He says, in the Philosophical Investigations, if a lion could speak, we could not understand it, because its form of life is so different from ours. If things are sufficiently different, if we don't share the form of life of a people, it could be completely unclear to us what's being said, what's being communicated. When we talk about like alien life forms. If those forms happen to be sufficiently different from us, well, we wouldn't necessarily even know how to categorize them. The question of like the presence of intelligent life or other life isn't really the question of the presence of life. It's the question of how would we recognize something as life that was sufficiently different from what we understand as living, what we experience as living, what we recognize as an intelligent form. I mean, it could, there could be a life form that has the characteristics of clouds, and we would never recognize that as an intelligent life form. So again, it goes back to this notion that a language makes possible a form of life, that the meaning of a word is its role within that form of life. It's a facilitator of a certain mode of interaction among human beings. I've emphasized that language doesn't exist to communicate, doesn't exist to communicate thoughts. Without language, there are no thoughts. Language exists to coordinate our behavior within a social context, to make societies possible, to make cooperative, coordinated behavior possible. Language exists to bring about a form of life. It doesn't exist to label things. Labels are things that have a complex role within a form of life. Okay, I wanted to read, and I've read this once before, but I thought I would read it again. The view that what I'm just describing runs counter to the common sense view, the traditional view of language, is something that one finds in many places. One finds it in St. Augustine's Confessions. St. Augustine was one of the greatest Christian theologians, one of the most important figures in the history of Christianity, and actually in the history of Western civilization. Wittgenstein admired him enormously and began his philosophical investigations with a quotation from St. Augustine describing this traditional naive view of the nature of language, of the nature of meaning, that Wittgenstein would counter in his work. But Wittgenstein began with a quotation from St. Augustine because he admired St. Augustine so much. He felt that the fact that St. Augustine held such an idea about the nature of language, about the nature of learning a language, didn't mean that the idea was correct, but it meant it had to be important because so great a mind entertained it. So that's an attitude that I think I've been stressing whenever we encounter anything. We might find that Wittgenstein is wrong, or Kierkegaard is wrong, or Goethe is wrong about something, but we don't want to dismiss them out of hand. Their minds were too penetrating. So when we dismiss them just without investigating more deeply what they're saying, we're more likely to be missing something of fundamental value than gaining freedom from an illusion. Okay, here is it's a little paragraph from St. Augustine just to give this traditional sense of how words mean, of how language functions, the notion that the meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands. Obviously, we're still talking about that first part of the talk, the meaning of words. We're going to get into the meaning of lives and worlds momentarily. But let me just read this. Oh, I've shown images of Wittgenstein. I'm not sure I've shown that image, but that's Wittgenstein. That's more the image I think that I've tended to show of him. Oh, and here's St. Augustine in a painting. He lived in the 4th century AD, so about 1700 years ago. We don't really know what he looked like. He was from North Africa. This is obviously a painting. Okay. Here is the brief excerpt from St. Augustine's Confessions, his autobiographical work. And he's describing his experience as he remembers it, of learning his first language, his native language. When they called something by name and pointed it out while they spoke, I saw it and realized that the thing they wished to indicate was called by the name they then uttered. In other words, it's as if the word is a label. And what they meant was made plain by the gestures of their bodies, as if, again, the pointing gesture was understandable at that point. By a kind of natural language common to all nations, which expresses itself through changes of countenance, facial expression, glances of the eye, gestures and intonations, which indicate a disposition and attitude. What those things are actually communicating is a form of life, a very complicated, elaborate form of life, as elaborate, as complicated as our language itself. When we study a new language, I'm studying Russian now, the complexity of the language becomes clear from the outset. That complexity relates to the complexity of the form of life that that language facilitates. Glances of the eye, gestures and intonations which indicate a disposition and attitude, either to seek or to possess, to reject or to avoid. So it was that by frequently hearing words in different phrases, I gradually identified the objects which the words stood for. And having formed my mouth to repeat these signs, I was thereby able to express my will. Again, the idea being that he has things to express, and once he has the words, he's able to express them. Now we see it as a much more subtle and complex phenomenon where you are, again, acquiring a form of life. The idea that words are labels is actually something that applies to the learning of a second language more than one's native language. In fact, one of the ways that one typically gains mastery of a new language that one is studying is to go around and label like the objects of one's common experience, tables and chairs and walls and books, with post-its, little notes that have the word in the new language one's trying to acquire, the second language. What Augustine is describing is the learning of a first language, one's primary language, as if it were a second language that one already had the basic forms of. That words are not labels, that words and meanings don't relate to these Platonic forms, that words are not giving the essences of things, the internal sort of nature and structure of the thing, of the object, has profound consequences. In fact, it's the ultimate basis for one of my aphorisms about the nature of time. I've repeated these often. It's one summary of my philosophical work from a certain direction. And it was sort of it represented the summary of an early set of my philosophical results. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. The possibility of the future deciding the past is ultimately because words are not labels. Words are not fixed on things so that their nature is fixed, is set, is settled, is decided by the word. Our language does not have the ability, even though we imagine it does when we have these, again, naive views of the nature of language, such as Augustine represents. Our language does not impose a logical net on the future. It does not limit future possibilities. If it turns out that the future differs substantially from the past, we will be at a loss for words. Our words only continue to apply insofar as experience more or less resembles what it has resembled in the past. That's the nature of concepts in general, the notion that a concept is pointing to approximate similarities between things, rough similarities. If there's sufficient divergence, sufficient difference tomorrow relative to today, we will be speechless. Language does not guarantee that the future will take a particular form, adopt a particular aspect or structure. Past cannot guarantee the future. And if that future is sufficiently different from the past, then anything that we believed relative to that past experience can transform into the opposite of what we imagined it to be, if the nature of future experience is sufficiently different. I've referenced the idea that, well, one of these fundamental questions, is life dream, right? That's a question to consider when we're considering the meaning of the world. Is it dream? Is it unreal? Well, life is dream. This experience is dream if tomorrow we awaken to a sufficiently different reality that persists. If that reality is sufficiently different and it continues day after day after day, then we will look back on this past set of experiences as having been unreal, having been a dream. It's a matter of sufficient difference between past and future. And I've talked a lot about extreme suffering, about torture. Well, one of the things that survivors of extreme torture, and of course there haven't been many, relate is that that under the experience of extreme torture, their previous life transforms into dream. And their reality becomes only the pain that they are experiencing. Literally, torture doesn't just break down the body, but breaks down one's sense of reality. Again, because the nature of that experience is so extreme, so different from the experiences that one had had previously, that it ultimately undermines the sense of the reality of those past experiences. That's the power of the future. The power of the future is, in fact, one can say, the power of God, right? The ability to change things sufficiently, to redeem things, right? That's, again, the nature of that omnipotence that we imagine deity to have. It relates to that comment I've made about death, about mortality. When someone dies, what do you know? That they will not return to the end of all time? And how do you know that? Exactly. We suffer that belief, a belief that we project into all future time. Philosophy is intended to free us from those beliefs, those presumptions, those projections. Not that we can't use them, not that we can't use them to design bridges or to write novels or stories or poems, but in terms of establishing the reality, the liberating reality, the freeing reality, that is the province, the power of rigor. And I've stressed that that rigor is probably the best representation of the ultimate nature of the concept of deity. Well, okay. Meaning in some other contexts, meaning that will bring us to a consideration of the meaning of the world, not just meaning of words as used. And notice, a little comment before we leave that issue. We're talking about a form of life. We're talking about interactions between individuals. We're talking about the use of words to facilitate various kinds of behaviors, right? We're talking about words, language achieving a certain type of what? Convergence, interaction. So when we're talking about the nature of language and the nature of meaning in general, we're talking about heuristic space, where two things are approximately equal, and the governing functionality is convergence. Now, when we talk about the meaning of an object, the meaning of a work of art, and that's a common situation in which we explore the meaning of something. What's the meaning of this poem? What's the meaning of a book? What's the meaning of a life? In general, when we're dealing with such things, we're addressing the meaning of something that's made up of parts, has elements. Every created work has elements that are brought together. If we're talking about the meaning of a poem, we're considering, well, the words, what are they all adding up to, right? And that's one way that we often talk about it. Like, what does it all add up to? What does it all mean? What does it all amount to? What does it all? So we're talking about, again, a mode of convergence. Things coming together, individual elements coming together. When we're talking about individual elements coming together, again, we're talking about a heuristic space, right? A heuristic space is a convergent space where elements ultimately cohere in an object. So what we mean by the meaning of, again, something made up of parts is what representation, what summary accounts for all of the elements? What are all of the elements pointing to? That point of convergence, that representation, that convergent representation is what we mean by the meaning of, well, of a poem, of a book, of a film, of ultimately a life. Right? When we're talking about a life, we're talking about something that has all types of identifiable elements: days, passions, interests, pursuits, goals, achievements. What does it all add up to? What does it all mean? So again, we're talking about a matter of that upon which all elements converge. So we're talking about something that operates within heuristic space. The ultimate resolution of the questions that considerations relating to meaning raise will be found within or in the transition to epistemic space, as I will explore in a little bit. Okay. And let me just say too, remember there is a connection between the heuristic, a convergent space, and the epistemic, the rigorous reality. And that connection is given by that last proposition, that the heuristic converges upon the epistemic. It has lots of meanings, lots of applications. One of the things that it means, and that will play a role shortly, is this idea that since we can't leave the world, since we can't experience the world from the outside, all of the elements that we recognize in the world converge upon each individual of the world. So every point that, let's say the point that I occupy, can be seen as a convergent point of all of the elements of existence. So each individual can be seen as summarizing the world at whatever point that individual happens to occupy, happens to be placed. But first I want to deal with, before we explore more about the epistemic resolution of inquiries into the nature of meaning of lives and worlds, I want to explore universal convergence. Now, one example of universal convergence is what I just described, right? Where all things converge upon any given individual, any given point, and ultimately produces that point. We exist at a given point that summarizes the whole. What's typically seen as summarizing the whole, historically, what's typically seen as being a point of universal convergence is deity, concept of God, of a supreme God, a supreme monotheistic entity. This idea was communicated to me through a professor that I had in college, but whom I had actually read prior to going to Harvard, and who had a major influence upon my actually going to that particular school. And the professor is Wilfred Cantwell Smith. Let me show you a photograph of Wilfred Cantwell Smith. Here he is. This is rather as I remember him. When I was in high school, when I was getting books, I think I've described, from the Library of Science, I got a book called The Meaning, and there it is, meaning again, The Meaning and End of Religion by Wilfred Cantwell Smith. He'd been a professor at McGill University, but around the time I was applying to Harvard, he ended up going to Harvard and becoming the head, the dean of Harvard's Divinity School. That he would be at Harvard, that I would be able to take a course with him, was one of the factors that inclined me to ultimately go to that school. At Harvard, he taught this one-year introductory course on comparative religion that was offered at the Divinity School, primarily for Divinity School students, for graduate students, but it was open to undergraduates. So I was able to take the course as a sophomore. So one-year course, 9 months, and each month was devoted to a different religion. But in depth, I mean, you can imagine, it doesn't sound necessarily like to spend 1 month studying Christianity, or 1 month studying Buddhism, or one studying Hinduism would provide enough time to explore, the tradition well. But at Harvard, it turned out to be, because we were assigned, lots of books to read, and I read them, and I undertook each month's focus as an opportunity to come to terms with that tradition, to try to enter into it, to try to see the world through the eyes of a practitioner of a particular religious outlook. And in fact, one of the points that Smith stressed was that we study Christianity, or we study Buddhism, not to understand Buddhism, but to understand how hundreds of millions of people for thousands of years have understood the world. So you see the connection between his view of the nature of religion and religious study to Wittgenstein's notion of how words mean, that a religion represents a form of life, that just as a language brings to life, facilitates a form of life. So it's not just a matter of becoming familiar with certain forms, certain objects that a faith might worship or might recognize, but it's understanding the whole form of life that faith embodies. In other words, how the individual within the context of that tradition sees, experiences all of life. So there's a Wittgensteinian aspect to Wilfred Cantwell Smith's religious thinking. Smith himself happened to be a Protestant Christian. And his lectures on the nature of God, of the Protestant God, of the Christian God, were especially compelling. And one of the points that he made that I'm always in mind of, that relates to this topic about the nature of meaning, is when people talk about being atheists, they're not really atheists, not in a significant sense of that word. That most people who are atheists are in fact polytheists, functionally polytheists. In other words, most people that, let's say, do not profess belief or faith in a God, in a deity, in a singular such entity, embrace many different things. They might recognize the value, the worth of beauty, or truth, or wealth, or power, or health, or family, any number of distinct objects, values that they might embrace. That's polytheism. Polytheism recognizes separate, distinct values, each more or less on a similar level. The point, Smith emphasized, of monotheism, of the traditions that embrace a singular overriding deity or God, is a convergence of values. That it's not health or wealth or beauty that's valuable, that's good, but only God. And that everything is good only ultimately in relationship to God, a universal convergence of value. That universal convergence then encapsulates the meaning of the world, right? Because we've seen that meaning represents convergence. Universal convergence of all things on God embodies that type of universal coherence of things. And it makes sense, right? That whatever our concept of God is, that concept will embody the ultimate truth, the ultimate meaning of the world. Well, we see how that sense of God operating at the level of embodying that sense of ultimate meaning coheres with how a poem means, how a life means, all things coming together. But the concept of God that I'm describing is actually functioning heuristically, right? All things converging on one thing, though again, when we have universal convergence, all of those individual elements eventually establish the epistemic, converge on that one ultimate reality. But the point is, and the Hindus, even though Hinduism is a polytheistic culture, the point is that there are some Hindu proverbs that make the point of monotheism, of a ultimate convergence of values on a deity that encapsulates, summarizes, contains the meaning of everything. One of those is Hindus, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, I'm giving contemporary form to it. A Hindu would say that he or she goes to a concert, not to hear Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist, not to hear Beethoven, not to hear Yo-Yo Ma playing Beethoven, but goes to a concert to hear God. That everything converges upon is an avenue to deity for a monotheistic sensibility, a monotheistic outlook. There's another famous Hindu saying that basically makes a similar point. The quality of a singer's voice is as irrelevant as the quality of a poet's handwriting. Where you hear that and you say, excuse me, right? The words of the poet are what matter, not the handwriting, but the voice of the singer is what fundamentally matters about the singer. Now, well, to us that seems to be the case, but not to Hindus, for whom, again, what matters is that both are routes or avenues to God, are convergent paths. So I'm talking about Hinduism, there's a Hindu formulation that is central to a lot of Hindu religious belief. The idea that Atman, the soul of the individual, is equal to, is Brahman, the soul of the universe. Brahman is one representation of the supreme deity for the Hindu tradition. That is a way of, for me, it would be a metaphorical way of saying that universal convergence ultimately establishes epistemic reality at a point, right? All things come together. We can't extract ourselves from the world. So far as we know, everything maps to wherever, whatever we are. That is expressed, again, it's a notion of universal convergence, where everything is converging upon our epistemic reality that we cannot step outside of. The highest level of generality for philosophy is also a point of universal convergence. What is the highest level of generality? It's that which encapsulates all things, right? All things relate to whatever this highest level of perspective is. The highest level of generality is that which all things share in. There's an aphorism that I wrote early in the writing of my philosophy that summarizes that notion. The meaning of the world is its most general representation. Again, it's a way of saying that meaning represents a kind of universal convergence. Instead of converging upon a deity, instead of converging upon an object that we cannot remove from the world, we're converging upon a a general representation that, again, everything participates in because of the nature of generality. That's a logical sort of representation, a logical formulation. It's abstract. It was a characteristic of a lot of my early writing of philosophy. It wasn't clear how much power that might have in terms of daily experience or daily challenges until the experience of the earthquake that I actually wrote about in Phalaris's Bull. And let me read that. I might be able to also do it. I should do it from memory, but let me see here. Okay. You'll see why I'm recapitulating this. You'll see the point of it. January 17th, 1994, 1:05 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So again, I'm describing the earthquake experience of the Northridge earthquake that I lived through. My mother had died 2 years earlier. My father had moved away. I was alone against the foothills, 10 miles from Northridge, in a single apartment on the first floor with a sliding glass door for an entrance. I had moved here when my wife moved out years ago now and had stayed put. But I finally thought of moving to a house near the beach and suddenly got the urge late at night to drive to see it. I should have. But the urge passed and I fell asleep a little after 3 a.m. Then the nightmares raged. The exorcist's bedroom, things flying at me from every direction. My bed jerked flesh to the ceiling. Wait, not the ceiling. A hole gaped beside me. The wall was on top of me, pressing, and it wasn't a dream. Then the trains came, smashing everything, shattering glass, churning hundreds of pieces of art, ripping more gaping holes. The Northridge earthquake roared. I crouched in the corner, my eyes burning from the incandescent daylight of the pitch-black room, in terror, an aphorism that had quelled pain and fear and everything, always successfully rattled around my brain. Selflessness, how one acts not out of need. But this time it did nothing, which only seared the horror. How long is forever? 45 seconds. For that eternity, the ceiling and floor above poised patiently to crush me, reach for something stronger, something deeper. The meaning of the world is its most general representation. Its most general representation ran through my mind, a logical aphorism at the foundation of the philosophy, giving the nature of perspective, putting the earthquake in its place. The chaos raged, but in an instant, like a switch, the agony ended. The philosophy was stronger than the moment of death. The point is that at that moment of death, when everything was collapsing around me, when I would have died, I would have been buried alive if one of the supporting walls, I was later told, of my apartment had shifted another 2 millimeters. That's how close. And I was convinced that the end was at hand. At that moment, that fundamental aphorism of a logical nature, talking about the nature of meaning in relation to generality, was the one thing that ended the torment, ended the emotional anguish of that moment, calmed me. If it hadn't been for that thought at that moment having that effect, that power over those extreme circumstances, I wouldn't be here, not because I would have died, I wouldn't be talking about the philosophy because it wouldn't have passed its most important test. Being able to address a moment, facing mortality. But because the philosophy, in terms of that thought, now I wouldn't go necessarily to that particular thought. The meaning of the world is its most general representation at this point. In fact, at this point, I find that when I'm faced with extreme challenges, extreme circumstances, I just sort of say to myself, the philosophy. So I don't have to run a specific aphorism through my mind. But that was one of the fundamental aphorisms at that time in the writing of the philosophy, and it worked. It demonstrated its power, and that gave me the confidence that these philosophical results merited sharing. Ultimately, now I started out by saying that meaning is not an object, right? That the meaning of a word is not the object for which the word stands, it's the use that that word has within the culture, within the form of life. When we talk about meaning, the meaning of life, the meaning of the world, what we really want is the upshot. It's a mistake to think of it as an object. What we want is that which, we want to think of it more in terms of its function, its capacity by which we would know it. And that function, that capacity is to resolve all of our issues, all of our concerns, all of our perplexities, to end all of the torment, the anguish, the wondering about our circumstance, to resolve everything. That's the power of meaning. Ultimately, the meaning of life, the meaning of the world. It has to provide a definitive resolution. That notion of a definitive resolution is central to the philosophical enterprise, certainly at the level of the great historical philosophers. Plato, Descartes, Hume, were all interested in resolving all philosophical issues once and for all. That was the goal, the motivation, the interest, the only genuine interest of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein wasn't concerned about being a professor of philosophy and earning a living teaching philosophy. He was interested in solving all philosophical problems. He wrote that the goal was that all philosophical problems should completely disappear. Right? And that's the kind of, it's the kind of attitude that Wittgenstein demonstrated, in all of his philosophical efforts. It's an attitude that led, you can imagine, to a lot of hostility on the part of professors, other philosophers that were contemporaries of his. Karl Popper was a celebrated philosopher who was driven crazy by Wittgenstein's maintaining having solved all philosophical problems, right? It would put other philosophers out of work. People, philosophers that were committed to a life, sort of teaching philosophy, pursuing philosophy, writing articles on philosophy. What's the point, if Wittgenstein has achieved definitive results and answers and resolutions and all the problems have been resolved? Well, as a matter of fact, a lot of people have felt that or did feel that about Wittgenstein's work. A lot of people left philosophy because of it. Cantwell, in that course on the philosophical investigations, made that point to us, that for a lot of people, Wittgenstein was the end of philosophy. And they left and pursued other fields. Though for others, myself included, it was the springboard. It made my work possible. But there is that interest in achieving a complete resolution, a complete solution, once and for all. that we're not interested in an ongoing process. We're not interested in something that stimulates discussion, stimulates discussion for the next generation of philosophers. Philosophy at the highest level, at the level of rigor, doesn't want to motivate discussion. It wants to end it. In the same way that Siddhartha Gautama wanted to end all of the issues relating to mortality, all of the issues of human life, wanted to end the issues with a complete and definitive solution. These individuals did not see themselves as part of an ongoing process, right? It was essential to achieve a solution there and then, once and for all. It's my interest, my only interest, a definitive solution here and now, independent of all future circumstance. The expression of that in Buddhism, and Buddhism is one of the exemplars of that interest, is something that I had on my wall when I was a teenager. It's a statement by Siddhartha Gautama that goes, "Even so, brethren, have I found an ancient road, an ancient path, trodden by Buddhas of a bygone age, the which having followed, I understand life and its coming to be and its passing away, and thus understanding I have declared the same." Now, we've talked about how Siddhartha achieved that result, that it was achieved through an elimination of concepts, right? Based on this logic, the real lasts, nothing lasts, his vision under the Bodhi tree, the enlightenment tree, therefore nothing is real, including disease, old age, death, every aspect of life. In the Heart Sutra, this result is summarized. I've read it in the past where the Heart Sutra emphasizes that there is no life, there is no death, there is no coming to life, there is no dying, there is no suffering, there is no extinction of suffering. That is the condition in which all concepts have been eliminated, have been ended. That's what philosophy is achieving, but achieving rigorously. In the case of Buddhism, it was based upon an intuition about the nature of change, that nothing lasted, not God, not elementary particles, not the laws of physics, not anything. In the case of philosophy, that elimination of concepts that eliminates everything, where all of the problems dissolve, because all of the concepts dissolve, is something that is realized, is achieved in epistemic space, where concepts do not arise at all. The space in which any two things are rigorously distinct. Concepts group things, cluster things based upon approximate similarities, but approximate similarities cannot deny the rigor of ultimate distinctiveness, point by point. I give voice to that in Valeris's bowl towards the end. It's a way of philosophically conveying what metaphorically is often expressed as the silence of God. Right? I've emphasized repeatedly that philosophy is not religion. Philosophy has no more in connection to religion as it does to science. Right? There is conflict between science and religion. They are both systems of belief. They are systems of belief because science achieves results through controlled experiments that cannot rigorously be substantiated. You can't rigorously perform a controlled experiment, as I've discussed often, because what? The world is different in different directions. That's one way to put it. So we believe in science. We believe in religion. We don't believe in philosophy. You don't believe in rigor. you have no choice. That's the nature of rigor and the power of the resolution it achieves. In Phalaris's Bull, I, again, have a statement of that. And I should recite it, but for some reason I'm in the mood to read. Well, actually, maybe I'll recite. What 2 points have in common forms a heuristic space, right? That is, again, a space in which things are clustered or grouped together. It's a space of science and technology and society and political life where two things are approximately equal for certain purposes, as the interchangeable parts of a cell phone or workers in a factory. How 2 points differ. And notice, that's the space in which the question of meaning arises, because it's a space that's governed by convergence of parts. Within, right, actually, let me go back to this. How 2 points differ forms an epistemic space. It is precise and rigorous that 2 points are not one. It's the space of existence, of reality, in which we exist in difference from everything else. It's the space of fundamental dignity, in which one thing cannot take the place of another. It's the space in which concepts, which cluster for specific purposes, cannot arise. And so in which the riddle of the world, itself a concept, doesn't arise. It's the space of salvation that religions have sought, and that philosophy incontestably establishes. Again, it's a space in which everything is resolved because the problems cannot so much as be formulated. It is the fundamental, rigorous reality. That, again, can metaphorically be expressed as the silence of God or mystical union with God, metaphorically here. I've stressed repeatedly that the rigor of philosophy gives the logic of religious aspiration, can give it a firm foundation, so that one can use religious terms of whatever tradition, because one can ultimately go to the philosophical rigor that supports the essential ideas of a complete and definitive solution here and now, as achieved by mystical union with God, but achieved within philosophy through the rigor of epistemic space, where concepts do not arise at all, including questions relating to meaning. It provides the solution to all of our perplexities. Those perplexities do not arise. Now, what I wanted to do is to end with an aphoristic book. It's poetic, it's concentrated, so it's impossible to understand. Don't worry about understanding it. It is a summary of what I've been saying, but in very concentrated terms. Remember, I've written a few hundred of these books that are designed for various environmental installations. I did one of these books, Proving God in Worlds from Even to Odd, a set of 8 aphorisms over the skies of Huntington Beach, California. I did another book, Tea Light, Book by the Sea, about, I think, 28 aphorisms in tea lights that were configured next to Santa Monica Pier. This is another one of those books. It's highly concentrated. Remember, my aphoristic writing is concentrated. Poetic writing is concentrated. This is both. So I say it, I recite it, or I'll read it just because it contains these ideas in a highly concentrated form, but also there is I think, a music, a quality to the language that helps communicate something of the emotionality within these ideas. So the book is The Magic Chalice, A Palace for Alice. And let me show you what that's like, I don't know if you can even see that. That's the title page. The Magic Chalice, A Palace for Alice. The Alice is Alice in Wonderland, the character created by Lewis Carroll. And it goes like this. And again, you're mostly, I think, wanting to just attend to the sound of it, but you'll hear references to the ideas I've been exploring. 1, meaning conditions that a view imprisons, wrongly, in specificity. The concept of God into its rigor, heuristic to a path, epistemic to a floor, inclined to an open door. Generality matters, that worlds are things, in relationality, casting life wings. The tragic sense rudely complains that epistemics slight heuristic domains, as if dignity's instrumentality and fantasies agree, as if such worlds could ever be, with everything before our eyes plain as day to see, in wonderland's swirling snows and sands, alighting Alice free. The emphasis is on freedom, right? The truth shall set you free. Philosophic truth, rigorous truth, the rigorous representation of the world. The nature of epistemic space is the freest of all possible spaces. In heuristic space, we are constrained. It's a convergent space. We are constrained even in our representations of meaning within that space. The ultimate freedom is the liberation from those constraints where even the concepts disappear. There are 2 aphorisms that I've painted into poles, into my art that you see behind me. Heuristics converge to constrain. Epistemics diverge to transcend. And that transcendence is ultimately the resolution of problems that the pursuit of meaning ultimately seeks. Okay, so that's tonight's talk. Now, last time I had a question. Let me read the question, and I will comment upon this in an unusual way for us. The question, oh, wait, I don't have the question in front of me. Okay, I have to look up the question. 1 second, I will get it. The actual question, oops. I should have transcribed this. Okay, the actual question is, how does the philosophy analyze the Russian and Ukrainian war and conflicts? Okay, now, these talks are intended to be philosophical, not political. When I gave a talk a couple of years ago on the occasion of the elections, the American elections, the American presidential elections, I was asked to give the talk because there was a lot of interest in the nature of the election and the election process. And so I gave a talk about the philosophical aspects of voting, of deciding, a process through votes, which represents a heuristic process, right? one of the defining characteristics of heuristics is number. And we decide an election by the greater number of an equivalent number of elements. So I explored the logic of that process, but I did not discuss the individual candidates, and I did not give any views on one candidate's merits relative to another. In the same way, these talks are designed to operate at a very sort of elevated philosophical level. And so I have to avoid answering that particular question. But I will say this. I think around the time that conflict began, I gave a talk. The actual date of the talk was March 4th. The topic of the talk, the title of the talk, was The Philosophy of Conflict and Resolution. So what I would like to do is just direct people, especially the person who asked the question, but anyone who might be interested in the exploration of the nature of conflict and the resolution of conflict to that particular talk. Again, I don't sort of weigh in on the politics, of the issue. I was more concerned with describing the philosophical considerations that underlie conflict and the philosophical aspects that relate to the resolution of conflicts, broadly, generally, and deeply. So I'm going to leave it at that for that question, just because of how politically charged, that issue is. And I'm interested in providing, philosophical perspectives and insights that help resolve charged situations. Okay, so I see I am ending a few minutes early, so maybe, I don't know, you want to, I see Aaliyah has returned. I think I should still maybe address the questions that might be offered tonight next time. We should probably still do that. But if there are there questions?
Yes, Stephen, thank you very much for the talks today. And we do have questions. Thank you, Yirkan, and everyone for your questions. We will definitely address them next week. Also, Eric Moss, Min P, Klavira Idrisova, thanks for your feedback. We see it all. So yeah, have a great week, everyone. We'll get back together next week. And thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we hope to see you again. And thank you again, Aaliyah.